Yo! What is up, guys? Welcome to another episode of the Player versus Live podcast. As always, my name is Gabo and I will be your host. Welcome to a new year, guys. Hope you guys had a wonderful New Year's, but now the time has come for me to introduce my next guest. He has a PhD in psychology, is the host of the Psychology of Games podcast, author of the books Getting Gamers and The Engagement Game. His research is devoted into understanding the psychology behind how video games are designed and how players think and behave the way they do. Guys, these are extremely hard topics to really try to understand what is the influence of video games, but I was super lucky to be able to talk to a psychologist expert about these subjects. I hope you guys enjoyed the conversation. Please welcome my next guest, Jamie Madigan. Let's just get going, Jamie. How are you doing? Nice to meet you. Thank you for being here.
Absolutely.
So, the reason I found out about you was because I was obviously interested in the psychology of games and I stumbled
Yeah.
upon your podcast. It was also interesting to find out about your profession because you're actually an industrial psychologist professionally and you were
Mhm.
educated as one. So,
Right.
how do you make the connection at the end to gaming, and why is it so interesting to you to find out about the psychology of games?
Yeah. So industrial organizational psychology is basically psychology applied to the workplace. So it's our major kind of charge is to make work suck less, to help organizations and companies be more effective and the employees in them to be more effective and happier. So a lot of it involves, it kind of borrows a lot from different corners of psychology, which is a very large field, but we draw a lot from, social psychology, the psychology around decision making, psychology around motivation and engagement, and a lot of those different things. Because it's all about how people sort of interact with each other in a structured environment in a workplace. And about like 10 years ago, I was reading, especially at the time, around like psychology of decision making, like behavioral economics, which is kind of what it's turned into. The field has turned into. It's the study of like how do people make decisions and how do they justify those decisions and feel about them and so forth. And I thought, wow, a lot of this seems like it could apply to video games because I've also like played games my whole life. I grew up in the coin op era, and then it's a habit and a pastime that I never dropped. So thought somebody should write about these two things, and so I decided. It was interesting to me at the beginning to borrow from different aspects of psychology to sort of explain, like, well, why are games so often designed the way they are? Like, why do games use like these reward loops or these systems or these modes of interaction with other players or this way of presenting information to the player? And I found that a lot of times I could answer those questions by looking at the psychology literature and looking at studies that had nothing to do with video games, but more to do with those core fundamental processes of like, how do you motivate people? How do you get people to get along? How do you get people to take in and remember information? Those basic kind of psychology questions
Mm-hmm.
were also helpful in understanding video games and why they're made and how we behave when we play them.
I understand that you have had an influence of games in your life, um, up to a certain extent. Do you think they've had a significant impact? Do you remember or recall specific moments of your life where video games either helped you in a way that you weren't expecting them to?
Yeah, I mean, they were always good for fun, right? So
Mm-hmm.
like fundamentally that's why most people play games, unless you're like a QA tester in a gaming development company or something, or a streamer. But hopefully even then you're having fun. And they reduce stress and they help you develop relationships, especially since the mid to late 1990s and 2000s, when the internet came along in its modern form and people started developing friendships and relationships and joining groups. But it's definitely had a big impact on my life. I worked sort of adjacent to the gaming industry for a while in the early 2000s when I worked for a company called GameSpy, which operated some third-party like matchmaking tools and also a bunch of websites around content,
Mm-hmm.
fandom for games. And then the whole psychology of games thing, even though my day job is nothing to do with video games, especially when I started doing that, that changed my, life tremendously because it gave me something to focus on and the times when I needed something meaningful to do that was just kind of mine and that I thought that people were enjoying. So I got a lot of meaning out of doing that, and it led to a lot of great opportunities, with publishing books and going and doing talks at conventions like PAX and meeting lots of great people who are also researching and talking and practicing things around psychology and video games. And ultimately, it's led up to its conclusion today with me here on this podcast with you.
Well, I appreciate that. You said something interesting in there that said that I think you were alluding to the fact of how psychology is now being integrated into this research process of the game design. Can you talk about that a little bit and give the audience a little bit of a big picture of how this actually happens?
It's definitely been part of game development for some developers for a long time. And I think even if you don't have a psychologist on staff, or even if your developers and product managers are not referencing, psychological principles explicitly and trying to implement them, I think game developers sort of intuitively, they iterate on things and they find out what works best. They're very good at that. And a lot of times where they end up is with something that is explained by, psychology or
Mm.
economics or one of these kind of academic fields. Companies have psychologists working in game development, so they'll work on things like player engagement and player retention and getting people to resubscribe or purchase, make in-app purchases. They'll have psychologists working in their communities to try to help people get along, to develop policies and game features that put people sort of in a better mental space so that they're less toxic, or display more team, better team behavior, more sportsmanship, that kind of thing. So it really runs the gamut. And I'm not so familiar with every way that it's being implemented to give you like a rundown of who's doing what.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also a lot of psychology involved in like user interface design. So,
Right.
when you're designing the way that players interact with your game, a lot of times, psychologists will draw from like cognitive psychology to understand like, okay, how much is too much information? How can we package information up so that people are paying attention to the right things at the right time? And they'll work in concert with people on the design part of the house to make sure like, okay, what we're doing is in service to the design of the game that you have in mind and the experience that you want your game players to have.
Mm.
We can maximize it, but if it's detracting from what you want people to experience while playing it, then that's not the right way to go.
So I became familiar with your book, Getting Gamers, and I recently finished it maybe like a week ago. The experiment where you talk about how researchers were trying to teach pigeons to play ping pong.
Yeah.
And in my gamer mind, I am playing Apex Legends or I'm playing Overwatch, and every time I click ahead, I see these juicy, numbers coming out, or this like mechanic
Yep.
that makes the sound really good, and almost like the game telling me like, here, do this more, do this more. And I felt like, oh my god, we are the pigeons.
We are the pigeons. Yep.
There's this kind of evolution of games, right? We went from something like Pong to a game that is so immersive, like I don't know. I play Escape from Tarkov or Cyberpunk, who was recently released. There's this
Yeah.
evolution of games, right? And in some way, the it is the nature of how they interact with our psyche that is dictating how these games are being designed. What is your general sense? Do you think video games are positive for society, or tell me what is your
Yeah.
general feeling?
Well, my initial reaction is that's such a broad question as to be impossible to answer,
Mm-hmm.
definitively. It's like asking like is language good or bad. Like it could be used for different purposes. Um, is technology good or bad? So in general, I think it's a medium, and there can be things on that medium that are bad for people. You could have games that promote hate speech, and you could have games that promote other types of antisocial behavior. In general, the games that most people are playing are not like that.
Mm-hmm.
And if you kind of want to start zeroing it in, to specific harms or specific benefits, then we can talk about that. But in general, yeah, I think gaming is good for society, and I think people are generally better off, if they enjoy gaming, playing
Mm-hmm.
games. There's lots of benefits to it. There's lots of ways that people enjoy it. Um, there are corner, cases where people play too much, where it interferes with their life, and or spend too much, where it interferes with their life. But those are, specific cases, and I think research is kind of ongoing around a lot of those questions of how much does this affect society at large, and so forth. And in some cases, I think those arguments are largely settled. Like, does violent media cause violent behavior? I don't think it does. I don't think we have any good evidence that it does.
I wanted to ask a little bit because you're talking about there is the potential for games to do some harm, and I was wondering if have you been any a part of any discussions about ethical discussions. I don't know if you've seen the new documentary, The Social Dilemma, of
Yeah, I
how
have watched it. Yeah,
so
on Netflix.
and it's basically raising the questions are, is it okay to make these apps and social apps addicting, and so on, and the same thing could be asked about video games, and I just want to know what you
Hmm.
think.
Yeah, I think that it's really hard to do research in that area, and that any policy decisions, or even any, should we make this product or not decision, should be guided by empirical research. Like, does this do things happen in the way that it is expressed in Social Dilemma or other, watchdog groups saying these things are bad? Um, it's difficult to do really good research in those areas. So I can't really speak to social media. Like, I haven't really
Mm-hmm.
learned a whole lot about that or researched a whole lot about it. Um, so I can't speak directly to that. But in terms of video games, I think more research is needed. But right now, I don't think there's a whole lot of conclusive proof that it's a widespread problem. And there's people trying to tackle that, and people will probably make their careers out of some real watershed studies that are coming up in the near future.
So it seems that to me, as you said, the water is very gray when it comes to understanding the effect of video games, right? Where do you stand? Do you think where do you stand, let's say, on gamification? Let's start with that one. Do you think that we should pursue something like gamification in areas of our lives that need more engagement?
Yeah, I think it can be a useful tool, to get employees more engaged in their work, to get people more involved in the political process. I think it can be a useful tool for engaging and motivating people. I think that, and in educational context as well is the other one where you see it a lot. But I think that gamification is often just kind of slapped onto something, where you put up like a leaderboard and, hey, I've gamified this classroom, or you put up like points and badges, and you're like, your work is gamified now. Can't wait for, the high performance to start rolling in.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a very short-sighted approach that the better practitioners of gamification would also tell you to avoid. And I think instead, what you're better off looking at is some of the underlying psychology around why these things work, and when they don't work. And in my latest book, The Engagement Game, it's not specifically about gamification. It's more about the underlying psychology, specifically at the workplace, learning how video games motivate people and get them to develop cultures and get them to learn and adapt, and figuring out how you can apply that to the workplace,
Mm-hmm.
for example. And in some parts of the book, I go in and I talk about, um, things that look like, gamification, like competition, like what gets people to collaborate and compete. And there's a lot of different areas of psychology you can draw from, again, where it's like, if you put a leaderboard in front of a bunch of people, then a lot of times what you may be doing is triggering goal setting, because they're not really necessarily interested in a leaderboard. They're interested in like beating their friend's score, or like
Right.
getting high on the leaderboard. My goal is to get a higher score, to do better and move up the leaderboard than my friend. When you look at the underlying psychology of it, it's all the same things that work in goal setting, completely absent of a leaderboard.
Mm-hmm.
So you set a goal, it's realistic, you get feedback about what you're doing and how it's closing the gap between where you are and what you
Right.
want to be. You're developing new strategies for changing your behavior and improving your performance. You're monitoring those strategies, et cetera. There's decades and decades of research on how goal setting works in different contexts. I always like to put that up as an example, because like it wasn't the leaderboard that changed people's behaviors, it was them adopting a goal. So yeah, you can do like points or badges, but the underlying mechanism is still around like reward schedules and giving people something good, in response to to behavior that you want them to do more of. And that's been, again, like studied for decades and decades and decades at this point in psychology, making social comparisons with other people and getting context for my performance based on how other people are being rated,
Mm-hmm.
as another example that I go into, in the book as well.
I mean, maybe a little off topic. I just my experience with performance reviews is I don't know if it's just because I didn't like the nature of my job,
That
but
could play into it.
man, it was really hard because I felt like when I was doing performance reviews and they were like, okay, so what is set your goals for here to 5 years, and I would look at the examples of goals that they would give me, and it's like, oh my god, that has nothing to do
Yeah.
with what I want to do, and it was so discouraging from some point. Are you saying that there's some way in particular that you can implement game like mechanics into a performance review to make it more efficient?
So what I would argue and what I talk about in the engagement game is actually that if you wanted to look to video games for inspiration on how to manage somebody's performance, you in fact would not do like an annual or even like a 6-month performance review.
Mm-hmm.
You would do something closer to what video games do, where you give people much more timely feedback. You give people feedback about their work that is specific to behaviors that they've done and not their character or who they are. You set goals for them that are meaningful and more short term. You let them make meaningful social comparisons with other people. So there's all of these ways that, video games do feedback, for
Mm-hmm.
example, all those things that I just described. And there's all of these ways that video games do goal setting, that kind of marry those two together and reward flexibility and learning and all of these other things. And none of those things points to, okay, it's this day on the calendar, let's sit down and talk about where you want to be in 5 years. Like
Right.
that's just not a very good way to do performance reviews. And it kind of matches up with the industrial organizational psychology literature and some of the business best practices, where a lot of companies are moving away from performance reviews, and they have been for like the last 10-15 years,
Mm-hmm.
to what they call performance management, which is more of like a day-to-day, giving you feedback, giving you performance reviews sort of as an ongoing basis, instead
Mm-hmm.
of like waiting, to do it all at once. Because if you get that sort of information, it's stale by the time you get it. You're talking about work I did on a project 3, 4, 6 months ago, that I'm changed since then. I'm behaving differently since then. Or maybe you only remember the stuff that I've done in the last few weeks, and you ignore all of my accomplishments up to
Right.
that point. Whereas video games are much more timely and much more specific and much more effective, and they keep us more engaged as a result.
Right. It seems that video games have almost light speed way of giving us feedback, right?
Mhm.
everything that we do in the game immediately, is transferred back to us either as like, oh, you won, you died, you did well, here's your score.
Totally.
um
Yeah, I mean, even if something as simply as a shooter, when you're shooting at an opponent or at a target, and you get feedback that you're hitting them, and then you get a different kind of feedback when you land a headshot or
mhm,
hit them in the weak spot. You get different colors or a sound effect or
yeah.
something like that. That level of immediate feedback about telling you that, hey, you're being competent at this, you're increasing your skill, or yeah, you won the match, or you were the MVP, or
uh,
you won that shootout because the other guy is going back to respawn. Then that information is valuable, and it tells you what you need to change or what you need to keep doing.
let's talk a little bit about the social implications of video games, because I think, as you said, alluded to before, when the internet really propelled online gaming, social interactions completely changed, right? When it came to into video games, you could make friends, you could make enemies, you could even get married sometimes. What do you think are the
Right.
benefits of these interactions, or do you think there is benefits in these interactions?
Yeah, I definitely think there are. And I lived through that transition, when I was playing the original Doom and the original StarCraft with my friends via, serial connections on our computers. And then I remember the first time I encountered like another human player in an online match of Quake, where I was just kind of amazed, like, wow, all of these other opponents are humans. Like they're people somewhere in the world that I'm playing against, and they're way better than I am. Was the other realization that I had at the time. MMOs, come through like EverQuest and World of Warcraft and so forth. Have talked to a lot of people who have formed meaningful relationships with guildmates and friends that they've met online. I've done the same.
Hmm.
There's people in online communities tangential to gaming. Like you could be Reddit, it could be some message boards and chat rooms and Discord channels.
Do you think that there's a difference between developing these relationships online and developing the relationships on real life?
Yeah, yeah. Of course, there's a difference, and there's different types of resources you can get and help that you can get from those different kinds of relationships. None of your WoW guildmates are going to help you move apartments or something like move a couch. None of them's going to be able to give you a ride somewhere. None of them probably will be as willing to like lend you $20. I guess with like Venmo or they could PayPal it to you or whatever. But people that and can meet face to face have different benefits than people that you only know virtually.
Hmm.
Um, on the flip side, I think there's some research that's shown that people who only interact virtually, or like sort of, they call it technology mediated, meaning like there's some sort of technology between you and the person, like that with those people, you're maybe more willing to disclose like personal information because you sort of have a safety valve or an out. Like you can
Mm.
control, like, oh, if they react poorly to this revelation or this thing that I've shared with them, then I can I can kind of easily control
Yeah.
how much I have to interact with that person. I could cut them out entirely. I could take a break. I could. So there's a different quality of those kinds of relationships, but sometimes it breaks well, where the person is very supportive and helpful, and you start confiding more and more in each other and sharing more and more with each other. And those relationships can be beneficial in a different way, and they can sort of have a different trajectory than real life relationships might, where
Hmm.
you have to be more concerned about managing that relationship and saving face and having a reputation, with people in your immediate offline world. So yeah, there's been some interesting research around those kinds of things. And the bottom line is that I think is that both types of relationships can be good, and people should have both types of
I see.
relationships.
Yeah, yeah. So you're advocating for both. I had a friend who, during high school and mostly college, he was like been a gamer all his life. Gaming had it was his place of domain. So like
Mm-hmm.
anything that there are these small things like that are in real life relationships that he didn't know how to deal with. Let's say like how when like your friend likes the same girl that you do, or and like what happens, like when that, and
There's a landmine for sure. Yeah.
like something there's this aspect of real life relationships that are not it's not necessarily very well translated into what you could get in your with your online avatar.
But I think at the same time, people can also practice interacting with people online in a much lower risks type of way.
Mm-hmm.
You can practice having conversations and sharing and being friendly and all those sorts of things.
Right.
And if you are a person with social anxieties, or you're have difficulty interacting with other people, then I've heard of therapists using video games as sort of like a way to either practice or get comfortable with those types of interactions, and then look at ways to then transfer those skills onto the offline relationships.
Interesting. The fact that games have now become a medium for storytelling, and within that storytelling, I don't think there's any other medium out there that really puts you in the shoes of the character, right? When you're immersed in this character, you're going through an adventure that is heroic, and there's challenges, there's trials, there's tribulations, there's things that you have to overcome. And in some way, this has also benefited us emotionally, developing emotionally. Do you think playing Zelda can actually make us develop emotionally?
That's an interesting question. I think that we can certainly experience emotions, and we can vicariously experience emotions, and we can work on empathy, understanding the emotions that other people are experiencing, other characters. I'm not really aware of any research that around like building something like empathy or emotional intelligence skills
Mm-hmm.
that you would then take into the real world. I think that would make a great hypothesis and a great line of study, and maybe somebody's actually already done it. But I would predict that yeah, that games, like other media, like books, like movies, can elicit the same emotions and have the same emotional depth, or they may not. I don't know how much emotional depth there is to a round of Call of Duty, or from a narrative perspective at
Right.
any rate. But other games certainly do go for that, and games are such a wide, varied thing that you get all types.
There are specific games that really where I can become immersed. Like they change my emotions. Like literally, I become either enraged by when I lose, or super hyped when I win. Right? Like sometimes I become so immersed that I cannot control.
That can certainly happen. That can happen in other types of interactions. Sports comes to mind as a big example where similar types of things happen, where you're so invested and you want an outcome so badly that you get frustrated and angry when it happens. And we could, talk about like, when does that extend into outside of the game, and people that cause people to behave differently outside of the game, or what sorts of circumstances cause people to be toxic inside of a game.
Mm-hmm. When I look in the mirror, let's say, we're talking about all these benefits, emotional benefits, social benefits from video games. When I look in the mirror, I see these things, right? I was like, yeah, I think video games are helping me become a better person, or are helping me be more confident. If I look at the landscape, right? If I look at the entire landscape of video games, it seems that, there's a lot of this space for, animosity and misogyny and like this troll behavior. What do you think that happens, especially in video games?
Yeah, it's a good question. If I knew how to wipe it out or how to prevent it in the first place, I could, probably go collect my Nobel Peace Prize. There's certain things that you can look to around how norms are set, in a group and in a community and in a culture, and how
Mm-hmm.
those types of things develop. A lot of it comes down top down from sort of the leaders in a culture or in an organization have a disproportionate effect on what people think is appropriate behavior. Influencers and other high profile people behaving in certain ways, then especially newcomers to that community will look at them and take cues from
Mm-hmm.
them. And on kind of a micro level, you can look at behavior within a game, and if your teammates are behaving in a specific way,
Right.
then you will behave in that way too. So if they're being toxic, you'll are much more likely, especially if like you're a newcomer and this is a weird situation and you're not quite sure how to behave.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the first thing you look at is the behavior of the people around you, and to the extent that you see them as similar to you, influential people in this space, then you'll mimic their behavior, and that cuts both ways, right? So if people are toxic, that happens, but if people exhibit a lot of sportsmanship and they're nice and they're encouraging, then it also encourages those more pro-social behaviors. And a lot of it is just comes down to the context in a lot of these games is competitive. If you're playing Apex and it's a competitive and your goal is to dominate and do better than the other player, then that context has an influence on your behavior as well. And again, you can see that in other areas, other spheres of human life, sports, business. If you're all talking about dominating and beating the competition and so forth, then that can have a similar effect to the effect you see in video games.
Right. On that topic of toxicity, when Overwatch was released, like one of the main issues the developers had was that they were spending most of their resources punishing people and trying to instill player behavior instead of developing the game. And it's a real issue for games because it actually halts the development of them just because people are not enjoying being part of that community.
Or they cut out, like, I'm not going to communicate at all with my teammates. I'm going to turn my mic off, and that cuts out a whole aspect of the game, right?
It's like if World of Warcraft didn't have social events, that would make the game completely different. There's a bunch of different social games, and one of the popular games that has come up is Among Us. It's like this social deduction game where you basically have to either lie to your friends or convince them that you are not the imposter or the murderer. Do you see any interest when you see a game like this? Do you see any particular interest from a psychological point of view?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. And Among Us is interesting because you're trying to like influence and get other people on your side of an argument, right? To say like, I think so and so is the imposter, or no, I'm not the imposter. Whatever it is, you're interacting with people either through text or through voice chat to try to get them to your side or away from somebody else's side. And in psychology, like, there's been a fair amount of research on persuade people. How do you influence them? I haven't played a lot of Among Us. I've watched streams of it, and one of my daughters played it for a while, and I watched her play it. But it does seem like there's an opportunity for those kinds of techniques to arise. Those persuasion techniques where you sow uncertainty, around somebody else's argument, and then try to sell your argument as more clear cut and more grounded in reality, and provide evidence, and you try to get people to ignore evidence that goes against your argument and pay more attention to what they are, and getting people kind of into a conclusion so that they then practice that human habit of ignoring evidence that doesn't support what we think, not overvaluing evidence that does. If you can build coalitions and get more groups of people to say like, no, this is the truth, blue is the imposter, then other people who are on the fence will again like look at those people and say like, well, the crowd must be right. So yeah, I think it's a really rich sort of environment for those kinds of things to come up.
Jamie, being a psychology expert, you're gonna murder everyone.
Yeah, whether I'm the imposter or not.
To me, the game it's like an emotional battle. Like sometimes, even if I win as a crewmate, if somebody managed to deceive me, it feels like I lost. It feels like
it feels like an attack on you.
and a lot of people actually get real emotional about the game. Like they think that I'm actually deceiving my friends. So like it feels like an experiment. The whole game feels like a social experiment where you literally are trying to find out which of your friends are the best liars, and you would never want to trust them
It's true.
again.
It's true. Yeah. I mean, I think part of the appeal, especially if you're playing with friends, is that you're getting a chance to do something
Mm,
that would normally be verboten, right? Like you
right.
normally wouldn't lie to your friends to this extent and try to deceive them and almost literally stab them in the back.
Right.
But the game calls for it, so you get a chance to engage in that behavior and see how far you can push it, and that's sometimes fun. I guess it's sometimes frustrating.
Right, right. But there's I think that speaks also to the nature of the medium, because when it comes to movies, books, or even games in this scenario, I feel like that's we look for them for ways to push the way that we can interact in real life, um to maybe like touch our boundaries, like push our limits. And
Yeah,
you can see that with violent games, you can see that with with a game like this.
I think you can also see it in like horror games too. Maybe a less of a social aspect, but one of the theories around why people like horror movies and games and all that sort of stuff is that it gives you a chance to safely experience things you would not want to experience in real life,
Mm-hmm.
and to sort of practice dealing with stress and fright so that maybe you're better at doing it when you're called upon in real life
Mm-hmm.
to do that sort of stuff. It's a safe way to get your adrenaline up and your sort of fear reactions going.
At the end of the day, like I can talk about the benefits of video games. Where do you think it's going? Like, do you think I would like to imagine a world like Ready Player One. you know,
Yeah. Okay.
that's where I would like to see gaming going. Like
You want the Oasis? Got
yeah,
it.
and the economy of the world also is running through with the economy of the game. It's also a meta game because you can play games inside the game. Um, so and everything is gamified. Even in the Oasis, even in the movie, spoiler alert, there's a point where the creator says like, reality is real. It's the only place where you can get a real meal.
Mm.
Conveying to the point that as much as video games can are amazing, there's nothing can really replace reality. So like, where do you see games going, and what is the hope that you see in the future, near or distant?
I think the world of Ready Player One is a bridge too far. I would not want to go that far where, my brushing my teeth and eating my breakfast is gamified and I get points for doing everything and it goes into some leaderboards. Like that's too much, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think gamification and gamifying experiences has its place, but it's not every place.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of like the future of games, I don't know. It's tough to say. Like we've lived through these big changes, these big shifts around, games moving online and becoming more social, and games becoming permeated through like smartphones, where you can play anywhere and play different kinds of games. I'm not sure about like virtual reality, if it's like a false start or if it's ever going to go anywhere. Maybe if they solve sort of the fundamental problems of cost and mobility and like, can I do this in a small, New York apartment, for example?
Right.
Maybe that'll take off. I think it'd be pretty cool if it did, because virtual reality is amazing.
Well,
The times that I've tried it, every time I've been blown away.
yeah.
But it's not practical in the same way that sitting down in front of your PC or picking up a Nintendo Switch or a mobile phone is
Right.
is an easy way to engage in games.
It's easy to walk 1,000 miles with a controller stick. If
Yeah,
you actually have to do it in an omnidirectional treadmill, you'd be thinking about it twice.
it's a whole different proposition. Yeah,
Right.
but I think games will just kind of keep expanding, and that's one thing that I love about them is that it's not a monolithic thing anymore. It's not. There's mobile gaming, there's PC and console gaming, there's AR, augmented reality gaming, there's virtual reality gaming, there's all of these other kinds of things, and we're even seeing things like tabletop role playing, like Dungeons and Dragons, having a renaissance. So I think it's just going to it's going to keep getting bigger and wider, and I think that's great. I don't think anybody should try to be the gatekeeper on what is gaming and what isn't. Like
Mm-hmm.
the wider the tent, the better, and the more fun people have, and the more people are brought together by this stuff, the better.
Do you think there's any stigma? Stigma? Gaming is in some way stigmatized.
I think it's a lot less than it used to be.
Mm-hmm.
And I was growing up, it was sort of a nerdy hobby, especially things like PC gaming, when you were doing these, because it sort of required a certain level of familiarity with technology, right? And that was kind of nerdy back in the day.
Mm-hmm.
But like I was talking about before, it's expanded so much, like everybody is a gamer to some extent.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody has played some game on their mobile phone, Candy Crush or
Yeah.
one of these builder games. Most of the kids in like a school have at least played a round of Fortnite, at
Mm.
this point, and they're familiar with it. But it's so mainstream. I mean, you see like celebrities playing games on YouTube and appearing on Twitch streams and
Yeah.
that sort of stuff that I
And
don't think it's
Senator
as,
AOC it was streaming Among
yeah,
Us, stuff like that.
yeah, that was great. And I think that the generation that grew up playing games is now getting in, places where they can influence the culture and
Mm-hmm.
help people understand like what is, stigmatized and what's not.
Yeah. Speaking of that, I think that as a medium of storytelling, you know, video games in particular have there's when it comes to promoting human rights and reducing discrimination, there's one way that you do it through activism and um,
Policy. Yeah.
policies, but there's also you can also change the way the culture is perceived. I think Overwatch, for example, is a big one. Like Symmetra is autistic,
Yeah.
Tracer is gay.
Lesbian. Yeah. And there's people from all around the world and different body types and
Yes.
different.
What kind of effect do you think that has on the general public?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right to draw parallels to like television and like representation of, different types of people in TV that we've seen over the year and how that normalized in a lot of people's minds the fact that these people exist, which they always have, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if you had a bubble, and you didn't get to encounter gay people or black people or other types of people outside of that bubble when they're brought into your living room through the TV, when they're brought into your living room through the video game console, that does broaden your horizons, and you start to see these types of people as not unusual, right?
Right.
Like this is typical. It's normal to be gay. It's normal to have a skin color different than mine.
Mm-hmm.
And there's been a lot of research, yeah, to show that just exposure and familiarity with those kinds of things can change people's attitudes towards them.
Um. So we know that. Well, we said it all throughout the podcast that the influence of video games is basically unquantifiable. Like we cannot put a number of it. We cannot say like it's made people more aggressive. It's made people more nice, or it's hard to say it, right? Because everybody has a different experience. But do you think if there would be, let's say, like I give you all the money in the world and say, Jamie, can you design an experiment that really gives us an answer to these questions?
Mm.
What would you be interested in investing yourself in?
Long term,
Long term,
longitudinal research
right.
that goes on where you follow groups of people through their lives and over even decades of their lives, and you check in on them and you gather information about their life outcomes, and do they have good grades, do they have disciplinary problems or problems with the law, how much media do they consume, what types, who do they consume it with. I've always been interested in a psychology of games perspective is the psychology around specific game mechanics. So people tend to get interested in talking about like genres of games. So like, oh, how does the psychology of a role-playing gamer differ from an action gamer
Mm-hmm.
or a strategy gamer? To an extent, I think that's the wrong question. I think it's much more interesting to look at the lower level game mechanics and design features. Like what is this kind of reward system and how does it get people to behave differently when you reward them on different schedules, or what's the difference between being able to customize the appearance of your character or choosing from presets? Like how does that affect people's engagement and willingness to come back to the game? How does having these different modes of communication with other players, chat, voice, visual cues, all that kind of stuff, of just getting into that real low level, like game mechanics and understanding the psychology of those specific game mechanics. Because then as a game designer, you can come back and say, these are my goals. Like I want to create a game where people are engaged because they're developing meaning, social relationships, and being able to express themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And so these are the types of mechanics that I should put foremost. And then all this other stuff is a secondary concern. Like, I think that would be of real value to game developers and players as well, and understanding like, what kind of game am I going to enjoy? What do I want to get out of this? And knowing that they're going to get it.
So I have a question for you. When what are you hoping when you created the psychology of games? You
Well,
wrote the books.
I create the whole field, but sure, I think what you mean. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you produced the podcast, The Psychology of Games. I think
Yeah.
it's more accurately. And then, you wrote books, Getting Gamers, The Engaging Game. What are you hoping, like us gamers, take away?
I hope that, when somebody listens to the podcast or reads the book or reads articles on the website, that they are able to approach games more on their own terms,
Mm-hmm.
so that they can use this information to understand, the psychology behind game design, the psychology behind communities, the psychology behind how games are packaged, marketed, sold, priced, etc. And to say, okay, I understand sort of what was done with intent here, and I can decide whether I'm cool with that or not, and I can approach it on my own terms, and I can afford to do
You want us to be less pigeons.
it. Yeah, be smarter pigeons.
Yeah, I thought that experiment was kind of crazy, in all honesty.
Yeah.
It was super interesting to find out. Yeah, thank you so much for being here, and I appreciate you talking to me. If anybody wants to find you, know who you are, do you have any plugs that you want to drop in?
Yeah, psychologygames.com is probably the best place, and you can find links there. I'm at Jamie Madigan on Twitter, for example. It's patreon.com/POG. But links to all that are on psychologygames.com, including the podcast and how to subscribe to it.
Awesome. I think it's an awesome podcast, so if I would recommend it. And Jamie, thank you so much again for being here. I think
Absolutely.
it was really fun, and I enjoyed a lot of our conversation.
Same. Thanks for having me on.